So welcome, Kerrie, Dr. Kerrie Moreau, who is going to give a training on K to R transition. As many of you know, Kerrie's been conducting clinical research studies focusing on sex hormones, exercise, and cardiovascular aging in women and men for more than 20 years. We're proud to say that she received a C grant from the Center for Women's Health Research back in 2008 and has mentored actually more than, I think about 7 Center for Women's Health Research researchers. She is currently a PI on one R01 and also the site PI for 2 other R01s. So has a lot of experience with this transition. So Kerrie, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Hey, everybody hear me okay? Great. Yeah, thumbs up. I like that. That's how I know you guys are listening to me. Hope everybody's staying healthy and doing well during this time. I wish this was face-to-face because I have some questions I'm going to throw out to you maybe every once in a while. My first question is there anybody on the call that currently does not have a CDA award? And you can unmute yourself and say me or whatever. So do we have anyone that currently does not have a CDA? Okay. Does everybody on the call have a CDA right now then? You can say yes or no.
Hi, my name is Gina Daly. I am the new assistant for Dr. Judy Regensteiner. So I'm just, getting on the call just to listen in. Okay. But of course, I don't have a CDA.
That's
so okay. It's nice to meet all of you.
By the end of this, you will, okay? Just kidding. So,
I don't have one either. I'm Elisa. I'm an assistant professor in MedOnc.
Okay, that's okay. Does anybody on the call have an R01 right now, or in the process of writing an R01?
I'm Fabrice. I do have an R01.
Hi, Fabrice. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks. You too.
Okay, so this is like let's see, make sure that this is working here. The outline I have for this is I'm just, I know some of you who currently have a K award. I'm just going to go over just briefly what the CDA period is, and then some strategies from taking that K award and successfully applying for an independent type research award. Usually we call these R-level awards. And then some considerations for writing your first R-level grant. And I recognize that the center has had speakers come in and talk about writing grants, and you maybe have attended some grant writing workshops, but I always think it's good to get a variety of perspectives because I don't think there's just one right way of doing this. And I know over the course of my career, I have adapted it because as I review grants, I see some grants I really like, and I'm like, wow, I like that style. And most recently, I changed up how I wrote one of my grants. Completely different than how I usually do it. So I always think it's good to get some perspectives, and hopefully there's some information here that'll be relatively new to you all. And if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and just jump in. If not, we can save questions for the end, okay? Okay, so the K Award is typically the next step after your fellowship. The objective of these awards is to provide protected period of time so that you can do some intensive mentored research that hopefully leads you to an independent research career, and you have a productive a scientific career afterwards. There are a variety levels of CDA awards. There's some to the VA. The ones I have listed here are all from NIH. This is only probably the most common ones. There are many other K-type awards. A KL2 or K12, these are institutional grants. KL2, the CCTSI offers these. And then the K-12 is something like the Birch Award. So these are institutional grants that provide 2 to 3 years of support. Importantly, you can apply for further CDA type awards through NIH, like a K-23 or K-08, or even a K-01. So K-23s are patient-oriented. These are for clinicians. K-08s are also for clinicians, and these are typically for like basic science research, although you know, other folks can apply for epidemiological or behavioral and health services. The R01 is for PhDs like myself, and then you have the K99, the R00. These are pathway to independence. So the K99 is 2 years in duration. You are having mentored research during this time, and you have to be productive, because then you have to apply for the R00 phase, and you would resubmit your aims to your program official, and then there's a committee, and you have to show progress on your K99, and you have to have a faculty position in place. So for all of these K awards, you have to have a faculty position in place. You cannot say that you will be getting a faculty position if you are successfully awarded one of these, because they're really looking for that institutional commitment to your career. So the advantages of a CDA is that you get 3 to 5 years of support. I like to call it a phase where you don't really have to grow up yet. You still get that intensive mentoring that we all need before we go out into the real world and run our own independent labs. You get 75% protected time for career development and for doing research projects. Know that the last 2 years of your CDA, you can actually reduce that down to 50% time if you have, if you're a PI on an R-level grant or a multi-PI grant, but you still need to be in a mentored environment. So I did this when I applied for my first R01. I reduced my effort down to 50%. So it saved money on, I still had leftover money on my CDA that I could put toward the project. And then also I reduced my effort in the first 2 years on my R01. That didn't have to go to my salary. And then importantly, K awardees, particularly clinician scientists, are more likely than non-awardees to obtain subsequent independent funding. This is not really the case for K01, so PhDs. It doesn't, I mean, although it does provide you with some important mentoring and career development, there's no difference between those who get a K award and those who do not in being able to get independent funding. So really helps clinician scientists. I kind of scoured the literature to try to see what has been done to kind of what are some of the best practices for having a successful transition from your K to R, and came across a couple of papers. This first paper here was led by a group of physician scientists that do cardiovascular related research. The writing group included PIs from really successful research laboratories of getting grants, program officials from NHLBI, as well as, and importantly, from individuals who had a CDA and then successfully were awarded an R-level grant. And so they put forward some good advice for individuals during that, before and during the CDA process. And then this paper here is just talking about, you know, how we can sustain the clinical translational research training and really empower that next generation. So I've pulled out some helpful hints that they provide in these papers. And this illustration here just kind of goes over strategies for success as an early stage cardiovascular physician scientist, but I'd argue this is also a good strategies for success for PhD scientists as well. And I'm just going to touch on a few of these in subsequent slides, including what you should be doing during your career development award, how you should focus and set aside time for personal as well as professional development. And so for those of you who don't have a CDA, that paper also gives you some good helpful hints on how to write a really effective successful career development plan to submit for a CDA type award. So it's important that when you're developing your career development plan that it's customized for you. Don't customize it for your mentor's lab, okay? This really should be what you want to do, taking into account what your background has been to date, the experiences that you have, the experiences that you need to acquire, and then your future goals. The proposal should have a unique niche for you so that you can advance and have an impact, so you have different avenues to apply for future funding. So really important that you're not just taking a project that your mentor has developed and running it during your CDA award. This really should be something that's unique to you that you'll be able to build upon in subsequent grant and project applications. So it's important during this time that you have that conversation with your mentor that it's okay for you to take this aspect and run with it. And so having those conversations, because I know some mentors will be like, well, that's part of my research focus of my lab. What are you going to do differently? Because you don't want to be competing against each other in the future. So make sure you have that conversation early on during your CDA award. And what I like to think about when I do my research project is that this is kind of like a book. And each grant and each project that I develop is a chapter in that book, or it's a trilogy, or it's a book series. So you're telling a story by doing all of these research projects. And so they should be logical. And if you have that unique niche, you could have a really long and sustaining career. One of the most important things to have that success from K to R is really having good, effective mentoring. You can't stress this enough. You don't want to have a mentor that's absent during this time period. The mentor-mentee relationship really should be reciprocal and collaborative, and it shouldn't be a one-way relationship. So both of you guys should be getting something on it. It should be very collegial. Traditional academic mentoring models in pairs of junior faculty with a senior investigator that's experienced within the same academic discipline. However, nowadays, with increasing complexity and multidisciplinary nature of research, we're moving to models where you have mentoring networks and mentoring teams that provide an interdisciplinary approach, but also peer mentoring. And we did this with a recent CDA award. I think Sean is on this call. We did with his application, and we actually put somebody else who was successful in getting a K-12 as well as a K-23, and she's going to be providing peer mentoring support to Sean. So it's really good to just be broad and apply mentors that can fill gaps where maybe the primary mentor is not as experienced in that. The mentoring should support trainees' career functions, but also psychosocial personal functions. They should help with facilitating professional networking, advising on how to negotiate for resources. For those of you who have received a Birch Award, Judy will meet with you, and she'll always ask you, do you have an office? Do you have your own office, or are you going to be in a cube? It's very important that you negotiate for these resources, because remember now, to be able to get these CDA awards, you are faculty. And it's important that your division and your department recognize this, because you need to be successful. And so getting the appropriate resources in place, in addition to the support you're getting from funds for the CDA, is important. So having an office, having a research assistant and other resources is important. So make sure you negotiate on that. Preparing for a career advancement, and then most importantly, how to navigate work-life balance. They surveyed some women and men scientists, and they said that this was an area where they were somewhat dissatisfied with. And so this, for example, why I can explain how to balance work-life to my mentees. I don't have kids. I have fur kids, but I don't have kids. So what I have done in the past is I've brought in one of my either colleagues or a former mentee who has children, and they were single parent, and I had them work with another mentee who was in a similar situation on how to navigate that work-life balance. So reaching out to other resources to help your mentee grow overall, both personally and professionally, is going to be important. Mentors should be trained to foster resilience and persistence, and this will help improve that K to R transition and limit dropout, particularly from clinician scientists. It is becoming more and more difficult with funding lines shrinking to be successful in getting your first level, your first R award, and it may take more than 1 or 2 attempts. You need to be resilient and persistent. I went through a period of time in my career where I was really successful, I was spoiled, and then I went through this dry run where I was not so successful in getting grant awards. And it's hard not to be disheartened and decide maybe I need to do a career change. So having some introspection on this, is it better to teach? Is it better just to go and be a clinician? Or is it better to go into industry? But, really important to train this resiliency and persistence because if you don't do it, you're never going to know if you're going to be successful. And then importantly, the mentoring team should be diversified. So making sure you have mentors that can help with underrepresented groups, whether it be minorities or folks from the LGBT community. So having more of a diversified mentoring team is important. And then identifying, supporting, and improving the skills of mentors and mentees through is critical. And I encourage you all, if you have not done this already, to sign up for the CCTSI Co-Mentor Program. And if you've done it already, sign up for it again with a different mentor. I have done this program 3 or 4 times with different mentees, and I find that I learn new things each time around because we speak different languages. Each mentee is going to speak a different language. Each mentor is going to speak a different language. So just going through this process can be very enriching. So I encourage you to do that. Developing your own research ideas. So learn from your mentor and mentoring team on how to ask good questions and not just convenient questions. This can take a while to develop. I know for me, it took several years. And during my CDA, I didn't know if I was going to be able to grasp that ability to ask my own questions for my my R level submission. And then the light bulb turned on and I was able to do it. So learn how to ask good questions, learn from your mentors. Your project should start off small. Don't be so wide and overly ambitious that you are just kind of skating by. You're not really learning the research process. Really use this period of time during your CDA award to develop your research skills through both hands-on research training as well as didactics. And then you can expand. And then learning how to write well with constructive, critical comments from mentors is very important. When I work with a mentee, what I do, if I make changes to their manuscripts or their grants, I'm going to write in the margins why I made that change. So that way they are getting feedback, or I'll sit them down and I'll go point by point why it is I rewrote that section or use different phrasing. So it's very important that it's constructive so that can help the individual adapt their writing style over time. Also, attending scientific writing workshops and courses can be helpful as well. The university does offer these. You can get it through the master's program, I think the PhD program, and there might just be some courses that you can apply for. Some societies and at some meetings, they actually offer these writing workshops where they ask that you bring a draft of a paper, and then at the workshop, you just work to, you get feedback from editors and reviewers on how to make it better, and then by the end of it, you can submit the manuscript to one of their journals. The other big thing during this CDA period of time is to focus. You really need to focus during this time and not be distracted by outside interference. As I mentioned with your project, you want to be narrow and deep before you expand and broaden that. working on first authored papers as the primary driver from your project and your writing should be of primary importance. And then during your CDA period, if your mentor agrees, transition to senior authored papers. This is going to provide evidence of progression to independence and readiness for that R-level funding. One of my mentees, we did this with, she wrote as the first author the primary outcomes from her CDA award, and then she had students in her lab, and so she had them work some of the secondary outcomes and some of the data mining aspects. Sorry about that, I'm being heckled. This allowed her to get some senior authored papers, because believe it or not, when you submit your R-level grant, some reviewers think you should already have senior authored papers, even though this is your first R-level grant. So just be mindful of that. Learn to say no to limit the number of committees that you are on. So be thoughtful about which invitations you accept. Say no to those that are going to have numerous meetings and tasks that are going to take up your time and distract you from doing your independent research. Say yes to those that are going to purposefully advance your career development. So these may be opportunities to develop contacts and research collaborations and other opportunities. Limit too many educational commitments, including developing lectures, although we do need this for promotion aspects. So you don't want to say no to everything, but just don't overburden yourself by all these extraneous activities that's preventing you from actually advancing your research and your career. And then if you need to, if you're being bombarded, I know this can happen with some clinicians, ask your mentor to limit some of these commitments, ask them to step in and help you out. You want to ease into mentoring, so you don't want to mentor a lot of students at one time, because as you know, it does take a lot of work, particularly if you are being an effective mentor. This can take up a lot of your time. You don't want to not mentor students or trainees, but you just don't want to be overwhelmed with this. So just kind of ease yourself into this process. And then for the clinicians, compartmentalizing your clinical activity. So avoiding clinical activities that could bleed too much into the time that is supposed to be protected for research. I know I've had discussion with mentors about this because I work with their mentees. They come to me and ask me to analyze their images for them. And then I go back at them, I say, well, I know that this is part of your career development plan, that you're going to learn how to do this. So let's actually have you learn how to do this. And the mentor will come back at me and say, well, Kerrie, no, these are clinicians. They don't have time to do this, unlike you PhDs. So really push back on this, because you have 75% protected time, and you're supposed to have that. You are helping out the division and the department because they're not paying that of your salary. So you really be a strong advocate for yourself. And if you're having problems with this, particularly if you're a Birch awardee, bring Judy in, because she will be a bulldog for you. Also, having defined blocks of clinical activity that's spaced out to allow for longer stretches of focused research activity can be helpful, and avoid scheduling clinical activities during predictable grant application periods. So if you sign up for when you're going to attend or take call, be mindful, look in advance of whether or not it's going to conflict with a potential grant application. Obtain additional funding. So CDA project support is limited. It's 50 to 70,000 per year. And although the mentor is going to provide some project support, you may need additional money to really execute the aims that you want and provide a really strong foundation for your independent R-level funding. And so there are numerous potential avenues to get these small little projects, which we call bridging awards. And they're offered by foundations and some, as well as by industry. And just some examples of this, the Center for Women's Health Research, that pilot seed grant, I took the opportunity, as Nan mentioned, I applied for one when I had a K as well as an R-level grant, just to provide some additional project support, and I build the research questions into my CDA. It's very important that you don't go off on another tangent that you're going to be distracted and doing too much work that you cannot handle. But the Doris Duke Foundation, for example, this is for clinician scientists, and this actually can provide you with support that you can bring on a research assistant. So looking at these other avenues for additional funding to just provide you with more project support, but importantly, don't add another project to do, embed it with your current career development award. And then preparing for your first R1 application, recognize that you may not get funded that first time around, and it could take up to 2 years or longer from that first submission. So either talk to your division chair, department chair on whether or not they're going to bridge that gap in funding of your CDA, or start early. Start working on your R-level award 2 to 3 years prior to the end of your CDA finishing. And then establish plans during your CDA, halfway through, how you're going to obtain the preliminary data that you need, publish the relevant papers that are important for that R1 that you're going to develop, or other R-related grant, and then also develop viability of collaborations that are going to be important for that R1. And so with that in mind, now I would just like to spend the remaining time on just some things to think about when you're planning and writing that first level, your first R grant. So formulating the grant idea, you want to do your homework, determine which institute and center, mission, and their research priorities, your grant application, your grant idea. You can use Reporter, which is an NIH-funded of research projects and publications. You can explore the types of grants that NIH has or is currently funding that's in your area. You can identify which appropriate institute or center you should be applying for by just searching on those institute and centers and see if they've funded a project that's similar to your grant idea. You can also then identify the program official that you should contact and see if they've have similar funded projects, and get more information on whether or not the institute or center would be interested in your grant idea. And then it could also allow you to find collaborators that have skills that complement your own. And these don't have to be collaborators at your institution. They could be external at other institutions. So for example, I'm an external collaborator on 2 other grant applications because of my expertise. And both of these individuals, I didn't even know one of them. And the other one, I had went and given a talk at their institution, and she had reached out to see if I would collaborate on her grant because she needed that level of expertise. She didn't have it at her institution to kind of show reviewers that, that you have the research team necessary to execute your proposal. And so this is an example for those of you that haven't gone to Reporter, but you can put in either a PI, or you can put in search terms. You can narrow it by the award type. So you can put, just look for R1s. And then you could look at past and current funding. And then you can pull up those projects, you can read their abstracts, you can see what they've published, etc. And so the other thing that you can do is you can search NIH or the VA, if you're going to go a VA mechanism, for funding opportunities. So these are program announcements. They highlight the area of focus, and these program announcements are usually ongoing. They have standard receipt dates of October 5th, February 5th, and then June 5th. These are renewed every year. And then there are other types of funding opportunity announcements called RFAs, or requests for applications. These are usually narrowly defined, and they have single receipt dates. This single receipt date could be every November for a 3-year period, or it could just be one time. And these are applications where it's a specific topic and funds are set aside just for these grant applications, and they're going to go to a specific panel for review. And then you have parent announcements, R01 or R21s. There will be parent announcements for clinical trials and not for clinical trials, so making sure you pull in the appropriate one. And then within the clinical trials, it could be a real clinical trial, or it could be a BESH, which is for basic science clinical trial. And then down at the bottom, I provided a link of how you can search for these funding opportunities if you haven't done this, but it's going to bring you to this screen. It's kind of small, so I apologize for that. But here you can, it has all funding opportunities, active, expired. You can just put for current ones, or you can see what they've done in the past. So I typed in perimenopause to kind of see what has happened in the past as well as current for grant applications. And the first one came up is actually an RFA that I applied for, my first R01. It was released in January, and I had 5 months to put together an application. It had a expiration date, so it had a specific grant deadline of May 16th. And so if we pull in this FOA, this RFA, there's a lot of important information in these that you need to read as you put together your application. So this, you had to have a letter of intent. So I had to submit a letter to NIH to say that I was going to be applying and who my collaborators were. It's okay if the collaborators change, but you want to include that in your letter of intent and what the topic is going to be upon so that they can have the appropriate reviewers there. And then it tells you when it's due and when it will be peer reviewed, and then the earliest anticipated start date. And it has other information on whether you would apply for a modular or a non-modular. This was a modular application, and importantly gives you information on what the objectives of the particular RFA is. So once you find the funding opportunity announcement, contact that program official that aligns with that FOA as soon as possible. Ask them any questions and decide whether or not your proposed research idea is an appropriate fit for this. You want to determine the application submission date so that you can plan accordingly with your grants administrator and your grants and contracts office for routing and that final submission date. And this is very important, particularly your first time around. You may not know what your budget is yet. So I would encourage you to start very early, several months, maybe even a year, because if any year of the proposed grant period that you're going to be submitting, if any of the direct costs are going to be over $500,000, you need to get NIH approval at least 6 weeks prior to submission. So you don't want to be start working on this and then not start working on your budget until you have like 3 weeks left to submit the grant. It's too late by then. And so make sure that you're planning well in advance for these types of situations. And so it's important that you understand the peer review process if you haven't reviewed grants yet, but you're all probably familiar with these criteria because they're the same for the CDA. You get an overall impact, and then you get the specific score review criteria, then there's other score driving, and then non-scoring criteria. And I'm just going to go over these, and I'm going to give you examples of how you should use the criteria within your application to drive it home and make the reviewer's job easier when they're reading your grant application. The other important change that has occurred within the past couple of years is that we all have to address basic principles of rigor and transparency. And the reviewers also have to address this in their critique of your grant application. And so there are 4 areas of rigor and transparency that you have to include now in your application. The rigor of prior research. This you're going to discuss past and current research, as well as gaps in knowledge, so that you lay the scientific foundation for your grant. You're going to put that in your significance as well as in your approach. And I'm going to give you some helpful hints of how you go about doing this. Scientific rigor goes into the approach of your application, emphasize in the experimental design and methods on how your proposal is going to achieve robust and unbiased results. Biological variables. So this is where sex as a biological variable is going to come in. This needs to be in your research strategy. It's not enough just to say that you're going to study men and women together. You also have to explain how you're going to go about analyzing your data by sex. And if you're going to exclude one sex over the other, you need to justify that. It may be that you're studying a condition like me, menopause, so I'm only going to study women, or I'm going to study andropause and I'm only going to study men. But you need to justify this because reviewers have to bring this up in your critique. And then the authentication of key biological and chemical resources. This is going to be a separate attachment, but you need to include this particularly if you are using cell lines. And I'm going to encourage you, if you haven't gone through this process yet where you've submitted this, to reach out to colleagues to get some feedback on how to go about doing this. And I'd be happy to be one of those individuals to help you with this. So the significance review criteria that reviewers look at. Most important one is the importance of the problem and whether or not your project is addressing a critical barrier to progress in the field. So one thing I learned from Wendy Court, who was one of my mentors on my CDA, is to use these review criteria in writing my application. I'm going to actually put the review, use these as headers. I'm going to take the criteria and use them as headers. So I'm telling the reviewers how I am addressing an important problem. So you can see here my header, biomedical importance to women's health. And I'm going to talk about why this is important and why it's a critical barrier to progress in the field. And I'm going to summarize that again. So I'm just reiterating this, the importance of the problem. And then you're going to lay a strong scientific premise for the project. What is the current and past literature? Where are the gaps in knowledge? How is your project going to advance this? And then if your aims are achieved, how will scientific knowledge advance? So I'll have a header that specifically says, how is the project going to advance scientific knowledge? And then I lay out within there how my aims and my hypotheses in research design does that. How successful completion of the aims could change concepts, treatments, or preventative interventions. One thing I want to stress is that you don't have to have all of these criteria in your significance section. You want to have, it should be pretty important, so you should probably address that, but you may not change prevention interventions, and that's okay. But if it does, highlight that. So I did that in one of my applications. Again, I have that header for potential changes to preventative interventions if my aims are achieved. And I'm going to go about and explain to the reviewer why my my project meets the merit of significance based by NIH's criteria. And then at the end, this is where we're going to bring up rigor. This is one way you can bring up rigor. Summarize the rigor of what you just explained in that significance section. And so I start off this section or I call it a summary of scientific rigor of previous research and gaps in knowledge. So how I lay the scientific foundation. I tell them how I summarize prior research, including preliminary data from my own laboratory are included. And then I also identify the gaps in knowledge. And then I have bulleted lists. And I just reiterate that there's a lack of evidence in that how my proposed project is going to address this by addressing the specific aim. There's a gap in knowledge, and I'm going to address this by doing an intervention. And then, there's a gap in knowledge on mechanisms. So I'm going to, again, address this, and I summarize it and reiterate how my aims are addressing that gap in knowledge. So essentially what you're doing is you're writing the reviewer's critique for them, because they have to list how your significance, the significance of your project is scientifically rigorous, how it's got the scientific foundation for what you want to do and how you're addressing gaps in knowledge. So write the review for the reviewer. And then if you are responding to an RFA or program announcement, make sure that you state that how your application is going to meet the objectives of the RFA. So this was the first grant that I applied to, the one I showed earlier. Here you can see the objectives of the RFA is to understand biological mechanisms associated with increased risk for health conditions with the menopause transition in women, and how it overlaps with aging and mechanisms related to oxidative stress. So right up my alley. And so this is from my R01 that was successfully funded. And I just reuse these words again, and I advance it and explain how we are being responsive to this RFA. So again, make it easier for the reviewer, tell them the significance of your project. And they can't tell you it's not significant if you are literally addressing the objective of what the program announcement is about. And so the next review criteria is on investigators. Most important is whether or not the PI and collaborators have the expertise to conduct the project. If you're an early stage criteria investigator, which if you haven't had an R01, you all are, and you're within 10 years, do you have the appropriate experience and training to lead an R-level grant? And then if you are going to apply for a multi-PI grant, do the investigators have complementary and integrative expertise? Do you have the organizational structure in place to execute the project? So for those of you who aren't familiar with the early stage investigator, you have to be within 10 years of your terminal degree. It's a really good benefit. I wish we would have had this when I was your age, but it puts you in a special category in that if you have a meritorious score, you could be prioritized for funding. So you get a different funding line. So for people that don't have an early stage status, the funding line could be 15th percentile. But for an early stage, they could have a 20th percentile for that same mechanism. So you really get some advantages. And also, you don't get the extreme budget cuts that everybody else does. In fact, you may get your full year, first year budget, and then only smaller budget cuts in subsequent years, where everybody else is going to get 20% off the board right off the bat. You will lose early stage investigator status if it's been more than 10 years since your terminal degree. There are exceptions to that, being some special circumstances like COVID, for example, may be delaying the progress of your career because we can't go into the labs right now. So having that conversation with your program official and explain that you may get an exception to the rule there. You won't lose early stage investigator if you're a collaborator on an R01 or if you're part of a multi-PI, as long as you're not the overall PI of that multi-grant. Then you won't lose it if you're a subcontract or a PI on a subcontractor award, okay? So things to consider. Your publication record is very important. So it's not just the number of publications that you have, but the quality of those publications, what journals are being published in, what the author order is. Like I mentioned, it's very important that first authored and senior authored publications. And you want to make sure that they are in relation to what you're proposing in your R01 level grant, and hopefully that they are publications from your career development award. So it's showing progress, that you're able to execute a project and complete it by having publications. And then it's important on whether or not these publications are original research or review or editorials or book chapters. So the original research are going to have more weight. And then your co-investigators, make sure that they have the expertise that you will need to strengthen your application. Bring in individuals or other collaborating organizations and resources that will fill in the gaps that you're going to need to execute this project. Investigate opportunities during your—
Kerrie?
Yes, go right ahead. Casey?
Sorry, this is Casey.
Yeah.
I was just curious, is there a magic number of the publications, or close to magic number? Do we need to have 3, 2? Is 1 enough?
1 will not be enough. You'll want to have more than 1 publication. I
mean, as after your CDA.
Oh, from your CDA. Hopefully you will have a publication from your CDA, because during that time period you should be publishing from your grants. Some reviewers are going to look at this differently. You do get a hall pass for publications. From some reviewers, they recognize you're in that early stage, particularly if you're clinician scientists. Believe it or not, you are weighted a little bit differently than PhD scientists. I think it'll be hard for PhD scientists to get away with not having that many publications. Whereas clinician scientists, you're also still having competing interests with you know, your clinical work. So having several, having at least one from your career development award would be important. But if you don't, what you can do, particularly if it's a clinical trial, you may not have a publication yet, and the clinical trials would be ongoing. So what you can do, you're going to hopefully have some preliminary data that you have within that grant application then, and you can say, put in their preparation for submission, okay? So that's one way around it. Some reviewers will recognize you may not publish from it yet because it's a clinical trial, so. Yeah, I usually go easier on individuals. I'm an easy reviewer, so, okay. But that's a good question. When you are during the CDA period, as I mentioned earlier, you want to investigate opportunities for collaborations with more experienced, well-known grantees or from other laboratories to help fill gaps in your own expertise and who may have resources that you may need. This will, like I said, assure your reviewers that you have the competency to do the research. And to start to do this early. Don't do this as, you know, as you're, you know, several weeks away from writing your grant application, because one important thing that reviewers are going to critique you on whether or not the collaboration is established. Have you published together? Have you worked together? So one way around this, if you haven't, this is why you want to prepare during your CDA. Reach out to people a year in advance so you can have these discussions, because then that collaborator can write in their letter of support that you're going to include in your application, and as well as in their personal statement of their bio sketches, that, hey, we've met before, we met together and we had planning sessions on how to collaborate on this project. I did this with Wake Forest. They brought me in to give a talk, and by the end of it, we sat down and discussed how I could add expertise to their grant application. We didn't work together, we hadn't published together, but we put that in the letter of support so that it, you know, so that reviewers weren't as concerned that we didn't have this existing collaboration. But if you've published, make sure you highlight those publications in your bio sketch. And I hadn't always been good at this, but include a letter of support from everybody that's going to be a collaborator, what their roles are. Also emphasize this in the approach, who's going to be doing what. Okay, and then the other important thing is for your collaborations, make sure that their expertise doesn't overlap, because it's going to come up and a reviewer is going to ask, why do they have the same co-Is that do the exact same thing? It just increases your budget and they're going to ask you to remove them and you need to justify it. So don't have folks that have overlapping expertise. You just pick the better of one, or if they have another expertise that in addition to that level, it's okay, but be very clear on what the role of the grant application is going to be. I get this question a lot on whether or not it's okay to have your CDA mentor be a co-I. Maybe, yes. If you're at a medical institution and you're still in the same division as your CDA mentor, you may still have them on your grant. They may play a small role though. And you can, this would probably it's not gonna be frowned upon, particularly if your grant idea is completely different than your CDA mentor's lab, what their lab focus is. So when I submitted my R01, my primary mentor was Doug Seals. My secondary co-mentor was Wendy Court. And so Wendy was on my R01. She had a small role on it though. But, you know, I had her on there because at the same time I was submitting my grant application halfway through my R-level grant application, halfway through my CDA. So I still had to have mentoring during that time period, but I also needed Wendy's expertise with a model that I was proposing. So there are exceptions to the rule. And then, you know, it may be better to have a multi-PI model. It may be better to do this if it's more multidisciplinary. Might be a team science approach. And if you consider doing this, then make sure you reach out to NIH to see if it's appropriate. And do that well ahead of time. So the innovation section, this is where I like to also take what the review criteria are and bring it up in my innovation section. So, you know, the innovation is whether or not you're going to shift research or clinical practice paradigms, you're going to use novel methods or novel approaches, or whether your question that you're asking is novel, whether you're proposing novel interventions, and whether you're just refining an intervention or methodology. Bring this up, point it out to reviewers so that they can just lift what you say and put it in their critique. So here's an example from one of my grant applications. And I just literally, for the reviewers that maybe don't review or read what the review criteria are, I tell them what it is. That NIH judges the innovation of a proposal by these specific criteria. And then I say, our application, we believe it meets these criteria, and I'm going to lay out how it does. 1, we're examining a novel hypothesis. You know, 2, we're using highly innovative novel translational research approaches. And then 3, we're going to advance, you know, clinical practice paradigms. So again, using the review criteria, listing it in your innovation section, make the job easier for the reviewers, because literally they'll just lift this information and put it on their critique. Don't make them search for what and try to figure out how innovative your project is. For the approach, you want to make sure that your strategy, research design is clear, your methodology is clear. If it's your own methodology and you've published on it previously, it's okay to cite it and be brief on it. But if it's not your methods, you might have to go into a little bit more details on that, and then cite where you're getting it from. You want to make sure, this is where the rigor comes in, that you are using a robust and unbiased approach, and that's appropriate for the proposed work. So robust and unbiased is if you're doing a clinical trial, it's double-blind, placebo-controlled. That if you're doing bench work, that you are going to have maybe the same technician, or if you're doing imaging, same technician, same person analyzing, you're going to reduce and improve reproducibility, or you're going to propose to do reproducibility throughout the study. So laying this out for the reviewers. Make sure, this is often forgotten, but any potential problems and strategies, alternative strategies that could come up during the course of the grant, and then what are your benchmarks for success. And then if the project is in the early stages of development, strategies to establish feasibility and how particularly risky aspects are going to be managed. And then importantly, one of the new rigor and reproducibility transparency criteria is sex as a biological variable, how you're going to use animals or human subjects. And so you need to address these, because reviewers have to talk about it. It's one of the questions that we get asked. Did the applicant talk about sex as a biological variable? And then if your project includes clinical research, do you have protections in place for human subjects? Risks outweigh the benefits outweigh the risks. Inclusion of minorities, members of both sexes, children, and this new criteria now, which is across the lifespan, so lifespan approach. So now you can no longer say, I'm just going to study young adults. You have to justify why you're not studying adults across the lifespan. And then how you make sure you include this in your research strategy. And so I give an example here from a grant that I recently submitted, and this was a clinical trial. And so with clinical trials, you have what are called PHS and human subjects documents now. So you don't have to put your statistical analysis in your research strategy because it needs to be in the PHS documents. The reviewers may not know this, so I pointed it out for them. And I have a section in my research strategy where my stats section and my expected results and my study timeline should be. And I tell the reviewer that actually the new clinical trial application guidelines say that these are going to be in the PHS in sections 4.3 and 2.7. So I direct them to them so that I'm not going to get penalized for not having it in my research strategy. I didn't have the space to include it, so I didn't include it here. And then I summarize my approach by how I'm addressing scientific rigor and sex as a biological variable. So again, it's not enough just to say you're include men and women. You have to also talk about how you're going to be analyzing the data. And it may be that you don't have the power to do it, but you at least have to say you're going to look at it. And then here I talk about sex as a biological variable. Environment. So is the environment, is it going to contribute to the probability of success? You have the appropriate institutional support, equipment, and resources to adequately conduct the project. And then is there unique features to the environment? Do you have a unique subject population and collaborative arrangements? And so what you want to do is make sure you evaluate the resources that we have. If you're going to use, if it's a clinical trial and you're going to use the CCTSI, they have really nice resources available for you for their facilities and resources and equipment that you can take that information and embed it within your facilities and resource page. However, it's a very long document, so don't include everything, only include what you need. You want to show that, yeah, we have this really rich environment, but don't include equipment and resources if you're not going to use it. So we have an exercise training laboratory that's part of the energy balance lab. And if you're not going to be doing an exercise training study, don't include the resources and the equipment that are affiliated with that. It just adds more things that a reviewer has to read, and it can irritate a reviewer. And you don't want to irritate reviewers. And if we don't have the equipment or the facilities here, you can't establish a collaboration with that equipment, budget for it. Put it in the budget. It's okay to do that. You just have to justify it. When I came here for my R01, I didn't get a startup package. I was still in my CDA phase. So I put in the budget for an ultrasound and some other equipment, a microscope, etc. So it's okay to do that. You just have to justify it. And then, as I mentioned, don't include resources and equipment if you're not going to use it. Other score driving criteria, study timeline. This is more important and specific for clinical trials. This is going to be in the PHS documents, protections for human subjects. If you are doing a clinical trial, you have to have a data safety monitoring plan and possibly an external data safety monitoring board. Inclusion of women and minorities and across the lifespan. If you have an NIH-defined phase 3, you have to have really, you have a valid design for an analysis. So making sure you have a biostatistician on your grant is important. And this will trigger a statistical review, a reviewer that is a statistician that's going to review this grant application. And then animal protections, justifying the number of animals that you need, and remember to include both male and female mice. And then biohazards, NIH has a list, so if you don't know if you're using biohazards, and then if you're resubmitting, make sure you're responsive to the critique. Don't be argumentative, just do it. Just say, yes, you're going to do it unless it's really not feasible or the reviewer is wrong. And then if it's a renewal, this is when you're going to resubmit and you're going to have a competitive renewal. You want to make sure that you are showing adequate progress on that, which means that you were able to enroll your participants, particular minorities, and that you have publications to show that, yes, it's worthy to give you another grant award to continue on this line of research. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, read that funding opportunity announcement because they may have additional review criteria that you have to address. So read those carefully. And then non-scoring items that we get asked about, whether or not there's foreign organizations, whether or not you're going to use select agents, just go to this list. Resource sharing plans, even though this is only for grants that have budgets over $500,000 in a given year, include it anyways because reviewers are going to be looking for it. And then that authentication of key biological and chemical resources. This is if you're going to be using cell lines and other things. So I reach out to colleagues if you haven't done this yet. I had to because I didn't quite understand what they wanted. So, and then budget and personnel support. So for the personnel, make sure you're justifying each individual. Don't include overlapping expertise and responsibilities, as I mentioned. This is going to be the best advice you ever received from me, but budget for a postdoctoral fellow or a student. whether somebody that's currently in your lab or will be in your lab or to be determined. I can't stress this enough because this will help with your mentoring, give you experience there, but also give you some more experienced help on executing the project. Reviewers are not going to view this negatively. And I've had a lot of colleagues, some even mid-level colleagues that had said, gosh, how is it that you get all these postdocs in your lab? Where do you get the money for it? And I said, well, I have it from my grant. They're like, well, you can use your grant for that. I go, well, because I put it as a line item in my budget. So what I say, my rationale for including a postdoctoral fellow is I justified them giving them a training opportunity. So that's okay. So just justify it. And then make sure you justify all the costs. So going through that exercise, if you're doing clinical research, when you have to submit your protocol, you have to submit a calendar of events as well as number of costs. It's a good way of seeing whether or not you're going to have the money to do what you want and whether or not it's feasible. And again, if you're going to go over 500,000 in any year, you have to get that permission. And also know that some institutes are going to drop your funding line if your budget is over 500,000. NIA is a good example of this. If your budgets are under 500,000, the percentile funding is 11 percentile. However, if it's over 500, you have to get a 6th percentile or better. So just keep that in mind. And if you have to, go up to $499 each year. That's what I do to to make sure I stay under that limit. And then just some other considerations. If you haven't gone through this yet, the PHS human subjects trials, if you're doing a clinical trial or doing human subjects research, this section does take a very long time your first time around. It is redundant with some research, with the research strategy, as well as with your aims. It does take a long time, so be prepared. Reach out to colleagues for examples on how to do this. Make sure your specific aims can be accomplished within the proposed times and the resources that you have. Make sure you have adequate preliminary data. You are technically supposed to get a little bit of a hall pass on this if you're an early stage investigator, but some reviewers are still going to be looking for this. And then identify experienced investigators to help review a draft of your application. Do this early on to provide feedback. And then develop a timeline and draft application of deadlines. And I got this from the CCTSI K2R program. Here is a good example of how to break out goals and deadlines, how long it may take to do each of these. Now, this was prepared prior to the PHS clinical trials sections of the grants. So make sure that you plan in advance for this. And with that, here are some resources. I'm happy to send these slides out so that you can just click on these resources that we have at this institution. The center has great resources. The CCTSI has great resources. NIH has great resources. A lot of information that I provided is from NIH. And then, some other programs. And then, you can reach out to me as well if you have any questions. And with that, I will entertain questions from you all. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that I can see. So, does anybody have any questions? Looks like there's some chats. Let's see here. Let's see. So we had some folks that were submitting or in the process of submitting a CDA. There is a great CDA program on campus, so you can get critiqued on that, the pre-K. So make sure you go through that mechanism. I will give you a copy of my slides. I'll send these to Nan and she can send out to whoever was on the call. Let's see here. So Fabrice, you had mentioned that you didn't have any last senior authored papers when you submitted your R, and that's okay. I'm not saying you have to have that. Just know that there are some reviewers that just think about this differently. I think one of our trainees in our group got this critique back from a reviewer that they didn't have any senior authored papers. So I didn't either.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. I think they will definitely. Really depends on reviewer. In my case, the reason I decided to go for an R1 was the data were very high quality, and project was kind of more R1 type than CDA. So that's why we went there, and we really enjoyed that. So I think for first R1, last author publication, yeah, it's not an absolute requirement. I don't think someone who has really the material for an R1 submission shouldn't feel, oh no, I cannot go there because I don't have a last author paper.
Yeah, I agree. And sometimes you might have to use some preliminary data from one of your collaborators. I've done that. One of the grant applications that I just put in, it's a collaboration with CU Boulder because they're bringing some expertise that I don't have. And I use some of their preliminary data and publication data from some of their publications in my grant application, and that's okay. The biggest thing is that you're telling the reviewer that you have the experience to move forward. But having publications within the area that you are submitting your R1 is going to be very important. Either publications or preliminary data that you developed will be very important. So it's not just going to be that I didn't have any publications in this area and my collaborators do though, and I'm bringing it in. The reviewers will be like, who really is driving this research project? And then they will probably come back at you to say, hey, maybe you should do a multi-PI because it looks like your collaborator is doing more of the work than you are. So just be mindful of that. Let's see here. So I think a lot of it is publications, overambition. Are ESIs more likely to be dinged for overambition than a more senior person for a given amount of work? Yes, probably. And it's possible that basic scientists versus clinical scientists could be viewed differently as well. I've seen this in study section where basic scientists may get a hall pass on some of these things where you're thinking, wow, this is really overly ambitious. Can they really study 1,000 animals? Where, you know, a clinician scientist or just a clinical researcher, you don't have to be a clinician, even a PhD, you could get dinged for being overly ambitious. So yes, some people weigh this differently. So I, as a reviewer, try to be mindful. And boy, when I see a really successful, somebody who has really used their CDA period, have a lot of publications, have developed this skill set, because what they'll do, they'll put in their preliminary data section, and note that you don't have to have a preliminary data section. You can embed your preliminary data in the significance section or your approach, where they say, make sure you say, I developed these data for this. So if you developed it, point that out to the reviewer so it takes that question out of their head that you're not experienced to do this. So I really like to promote the early stage, particularly the new investigators. When I see that they've published a lot, they have some really cool data, they have these really integrative skill sets that are unique. And so I really try to point that out when I'm reviewing these applications, particularly if it's a really well-written grant application. So that's a big thing, is making sure your grant is logical and well-written, making it easier on the reviewer. Because keep in mind that when reviewers are gonna probably have 8 to a dozen of these to review, and the more you can make it easier on them, the better that they're gonna advocate for you. And just really pointing out how your grant is really novel, and you're, like I said, filling that gap in knowledge. So these new criteria are all new to reviewers as well, as we're just kind of getting used to reading these type of applications. So that's the best advice I ever got from a mentor, Wendy Court, was like just taking that review criteria and stating it in the application, using it as headers. And then they can't tell you that your project's not significant because you've told them using their review criteria why it is. Let's see here. I think that's all the questions that are listed in the chat. Does anybody have any other questions that they want to ask? You can also reach out to me via email, or if you want to have coffee or something like that. I'm happy to help you, or when you are in the process of submitting that grant, if you want me to take a look at it, I'm happy to do so. That's the best advice I can give you, is to make sure you reach out to experienced groups. Our research group, the image group, we have opportunities where people can come in. I know, Casey, you've done this, where you present grant ideas. So we can do this. And then the CCTSI has that K-to-R submission where you can get some feedback on your first K award. But just be very cognizant of the time it's going to take to put together your first one. And you've already done a CDA application, and I would argue there's probably more work that goes into them because you have to develop a career development plan as well. But an R level, particularly if you're doing clinical research or human subjects, may take a little extra time just given these new sections that we have to do. So,
Kerrie, I had a question. Thank you for all this wonderful information. This is Danielle Serrano. I'm just on entering year 4 and have entered year 4 on my K.
Okay.
And I'm starting to put together my R01 and going to do the research studio next week.
Good.
But I guess one of my the thing that kind of wakes me up at night sometimes is that I got additional funding during my K award, and that project just took off and really is what I ended up publishing the most on, and is what I'm going to bounce the R01 off of from that work. And I think I worry that the subject of my K award, which is also going to be productive but hasn't been as productive during this time, I worry, I guess, will it look bad if I've kind of gone off in a different direction from my K, or is it okay as long as I was still productive on the main work I was doing, and just kind of dug into a whole nother project.
Question, are they related at all, or somewhat?
Yeah, they're related.
Then that's okay. That's okay, because you know what? When the reviewers look at your bio sketch and they see your projects and your research support, they're not going to see what aims you have. So as long as they're somewhat related to what your CDA is, then you're going to be okay. Yeah. So for example, my CDA was on studying hormone replacement therapy alone and with exercise, and my R01 was studying aging in relation to the menopause transition. So I wasn't studying hormone replacement therapy at all. But I was able to develop some preliminary data. I had multiple projects built into my CDA that I used because I was doing a clinical trial in my CDA, so it was going to take forever to get that done. So I had to build in these little mini projects to get publications out of it. And I didn't even publish my my primary paper from my K01 until, gosh, almost year 3 maybe, or year 4 of my R01. So, but I had published other papers that were in the general theme of it, so it's okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Does anybody else have any questions? And for those of you that
Nan's on mute. I think she was jumping in there.
Who is?
Nan, you're on mute.
I had unmuted, and then thank you so much, Kerrie. I think we're about out of time, but appreciate everybody joining. We'll send out a survey, and you might have gotten invitation to attend the next researcher training on August 21st, and Dr. Thomas Flagg will be speaking about the transition back to research.
If I can just make one comment, and that is, for those of you still on, please fill out these evaluations, because I didn't really know how to go with this because it's a pretty broad topic. And if I ever get invited back to do the same topic, I will adapt it to make sure that I am meeting the needs that you all may have. So I want to make sure I'm giving you the best information and not things that you already know. So any feedback that you can provide in the evaluation will be helpful for me. So thank you. And with that, I want to say, everybody stay healthy, wear your mask, wash your hands, social distance, and reach out to me if you need anything at all.
Thank you so much, Kerrie. We really appreciate your time and expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you.